From Spitalfields to Whitechapel and down into the Docklands via the Ratcliffe Highway and St George's in the east, Victorian London's East End was awash with poverty. Industrialisation, immigration and unprecedented population growth shaped the character of these districts. The working classes found low-skilled and even lower-paid jobs in factories, wharfs and textile sweatshops and, as a result, crowded into inadequate accommodation to save on the high cost of renting from unscrupulous landlords, often subletting their room to lodgers to make ends meet. Common lodging houses met much of the demand for cheap housing, often filthy and poorly maintained. They were let on a nightly basis, typically to casual workers, the poor, sick and unemployed. It is in these living conditions that people struggled long hours to pay the cost of their lodgings, food and clothing, exploited by long working hours in return for a low wage, to give much of it away to crooked landlords. Poverty-stricken and trapped by circumstances beyond their control, how could a person expect to free themselves from such an existence? For this was no life. For much of the 19th century society was ignorant to the plight of the poor, or worse still, considered their circumstances to be self-inflicted. There was a belief among the upper classes that poverty was the cause of idleness and immorality, and that their way out of poverty was through hard work and education. But how do you climb out of the abyss when you find yourself in the pit of despair by birth? When you are so poor that you are forced to send your child onto the streets to work instead of sending them to school. There was no state means of support and little other choice. Such was the fate offered you by accident of being born to working-class parents in England's towns and cities. It might make you think whether they were right to work so hard for an honest living, for bed and board, when there were criminals doing so much better. And it will come as no surprise to you that Spitalfields and Whitechapel was the lair of thieves and a den of prostitution. Considering such abject poverty, it is this question of morality and sin that our reporter in this video, a gentleman of the church investigating the living conditions of the poor, whom he calls outcasts, begins to grapple with, but offers few solutions as to how the poor can make ends meet. You will learn from the people he meets just how hard working life was, how it consumed their every waking hour, and why the prospect of a premature death was seemingly the only means of escape. Let me know in the comment section what you would do if you are faced with the limited choices in life like the people our reporter meets. Would you accept your fate and struggle daily to clothe and feed yourself, or turn away from an honourable existence? Before we move on, please consider clicking the subscribe button for more content like this. If you find this video interesting, I would really appreciate it if you could give it a thumbs up and share it widely with friends and family. You can also support the channel and get access to exclusive perks by becoming a channel member. Check out the Join button and description for more. A difficulty with which we have to contend, and one in large measure the cause of why we have squalid living conditions, is the poverty of the miserable outcasts. The poverty, we mean, of those who try to live honestly, for notwithstanding the sickening revelations of immorality which have been disclosed to us, those who endeavour to earn their bread by honest work far outnumber the dishonest, and it is to their infinite credit that it should be so, considering that they are daily face to face with the contrast between their wretched earnings and those which are the produce of sin. A child 7 years old is known easily to make 10 shillings 6 a week by thieving. But what can he earn by such work as matchbox making, for which 2.5 a gross is paid, the maker having to find his own fire for drying the boxes, and his own paste and string? Before he can gain as much as the young thief, he must make 56 gross of matchboxes a week, or 1,296 a day. It is needless to say that this is impossible, for even adults can rarely make more than an average of half that number. How long, then, must the little hands toil before they can earn the price of the scantiest meal? Women, for the work of trousers finishing, that is, sewing in linings, making buttonholes and stitching on the buttons, receive 2.5 pence a pair, and have to find their own thread. We ask a woman who is making tweed trousers how much she can earn in a day, and are told 1 shilling. But what does a day mean to this poor soul? 17 hours! From 5 in the morning to 10 at night. No pause for meals. She eats her crust and drinks a little tea as she works, making in very truth, with her needle and thread, not her living only, but her shroud. For making men's shirts, these women are paid 10 pence a dozen, lawn tennis aprons 3 pence a dozen, and babies' hoods from 1 shilling 6 pence to 2 shillings 6 pence a dozen. In St. George's in the East, large numbers of women and children, some of the latter only 7 years old, are employed in sack-making, for which they get a farthing, 1/4 of a penny, each. In one house was found a widow and her half-simple daughter making palliasses, mattresses stuffed with straw, horsehair, wool or feathers, at 1 3/4 pence each. Here is a woman who has a sick husband and a little child to look after. She is employed at shirt finishing at 3 pence a dozen, and by the utmost effort can only earn 6 pence a day, out of which she has to find her own thread. Another, with a crippled hand, maintains herself and a blind husband by matchbox making, for which she is remunerated on the liberal scale mentioned above. And out of her 2.5 gross, she has to pay a girl a penny a gross to help her. Others obtain at Covent Garden in the season 1 pence or 2 pence a peck for shelling peas, or 6 pence a basket for walnuts, and they do well if their labour brings them 10 pence or a shilling a day. With men it is comparatively speaking no better. "My master," says one man visited by a recent writer in the Fortnightly Review, "gets £1 for what he gives me 3 shillings for making." And this it is easy to believe, when we know that for a pair of fishing boots, which will be sold at 3 guineas, the poor workman receives 5 shillings 3 pence, if they are made to order, or 4 shillings 6 pence if made for stock. An old tailor and his wife are employed in making policemen's overcoats. They have to make, finish, hot press, put on the buttons, and find their own thread, and for all this they receive 2 shillings 10 pence for each coat. This old couple work from 6:30 in the morning until 10 at night, and between them can just manage to make a coat in 2 days. Here is a mother who has taken away whatever articles of clothing she can strip from her 4 little children without leaving them absolutely naked. She has pawned them, not for drink, but for coals and food. A shilling is all she can procure, and with this she has bought 7 pounds of coals and a loaf of bread. We might fill page after page with these dreary details, but they would become sadly monotonous, for it is the same everywhere. And then it should not be forgotten how hardly upon poverty like this must press the exorbitant demand for rent. Even the rack-renting of Ireland, being forced to pay more in rent than you can afford, which so stirred our indignation a little while ago, was merciful by comparison. If by any chance a reluctant landlord can be induced to execute or pay for some long-needed repairs, they become the occasion for new exactions. Going through these rooms, we come to one in which a hole as big as a man's head has been roughly covered, and how? A piece of board from an old soap-box has been fixed over the opening by 1 nail, and to the tenant has been given 1.5 yards of paper with which to cover it. And for this expenditure, perhaps 4 pence at the outside, 3 pence a week has been put upon the rent. If this is enough to arouse our indignation, what must be thought of the following? The 2 old people just mentioned have lived in one room for 14 years, during which time it has only once been partially cleansed. The landlord has undertaken that it shall be done shortly, and for the past 3 months has been taking 6 pence a week extra for rent for what he is thus going to do. This is what the helpless have to submit to. They are charged for these pestilential dens a rent which consumes half the earnings of a family and leaves them no more than from 4 pence to 6 pence a day for food, clothing, and fire. A grinding of the faces of the poor which could scarcely be paralleled in oppression. This, however, is not all. For even these depths of poverty and degradation are reached by the Education Act, and however beneficent its purpose, it bears with cruel weight upon the class we have described, to whom 2 pence or 1 penny a week for the school fees of each of 3 or 4 children means so much lack of bread.